know you. You're that jaywalking punk anarchist.
You're that jaywalking punk anarchist. Jaywalking punk anarchist.
Hello, this is the Radical Reviewer taking a look at The Working Class Majority by Michael Zweig, ILR Press, 2000. The key idea of this text is that the myth of a middle-class America is just that, a myth. That the American people have long been primarily working class. A working class majority, if you will. Zweig summarizes the book in this way. This book makes three basic points. First, economic classes exist in U.S. society. Second, class has a pervasive influence on the way we live, work, and think. And third, class has great influence on politics, electoral politics, and the more general contests of power that operate throughout society. To highlight what I find most enlightening about this text, I'd like to note Zweig's explanation of what class isn't. Zweig defines class as the power we have in the economy, and not as a consumer category, as the modern American conception of class is so often framed. Do you have a car, a smartphone, a computer, a game console, an apartment, or especially a house? Well, sounds like you're middle class, bucko.
Poor families in the United States are not what they used to be. 99% of them have a refrigerator. The image we have of poor people as starving and living in squalor really is not accurate. Many of them have things. What they lack is the richness of spirit. What they lack is the richness of spirit.
You're middle class, bro. And if you're working two jobs to make ends meet, or if you have zero control or bargaining power in your workplace, just look at whatever phone or computer you're watching this video on. Clearly, you're middle class. You're just lacking that richness of spirit.
The richness of spirit.
Defining class by income or lifestyle or access to certain consumer goods with no conversation of what type of work provided those commodities and what type of power that work garners in the economy makes almost all Americans middle class and renders the term meaningless. Zweig argues that workers in America need to abandon their consumer mindset of class and return to a worker mindset, and that a working class that is conscious of their position in the economy as a working class majority can demand that governments and union institutions curb the excesses of capitalism and provide a better life for workers. Let's take a look at the text in depth. Chapter 1. The Class Structure of the United States. This chapter is full of facts and figures that basically demonstrate that the American class system is racist and sexist and that a majority of Americans are working class. With Zweig defining class as the power people have in the economy, he looks at the working class and states, on the job, most workers have little control over the pace and content of their work. They show up, a supervisor shows them the job, and they do it.
We are Walmart. Everybody, one more time. We are Walmart. Last time.
Zweig argues that some workers, like those in co-ops or democratic workplaces, may have some control over their particular workplace, but that this power does not transfer to the broader economy as a whole, and so these workers are still working class. Lastly, Zweig explains that with class defined as the power you have in the economy, class distinctions can be pretty messy. You know, like, is a small business owner who works alongside his staff a few hours a week working class, or a capitalist? Zweig states, classes are formed in the dynamics of power and wealth creation, and are by their nature a bit messy. Classes are more complicated, more interesting, and more real than the arbitrary income levels used to define class in the conventional wisdom. With defining class as the power one has in the economy, I think Zweig would agree with the definition I've often used, which is that working class folks live primarily off their own labor, while capitalists live primarily off the labor of others. Chapter 2. What we think about when we think about class. Zweig argues that 4 things have shaped how we think about class in America. These 4 things have killed the American working class identity and replaced it with a middle-class myth. These things are upward mobility, consumerism, the Cold War, and the media. Upward mobility. I'm sure you've been preached the gospel of upward mobility, pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, some cherry-picked stories of rags to riches, and all that. It can be tempting to fall for the mythology. Have I experienced upward mobility? Perhaps it might seem so. I have more consumer goods than my mother did at my age. I have 2 TVs, 2 game consoles, and 2 laptops, for Christ's sakes. Literally doubling the comparative 1 NES, 1 Windows 95 PC, and 1 wood panel TV of my childhood. Did I experience upward mobility? Am I middle class now? Not really. Consumer goods have just gotten cheaper and more available overall. I have a master's degree where my mother only has an associate's degree. Have I experienced upward mobility? Does this make me middle class? Well, not really. I have very little say over the office I work at. Well, when it's not closed due to the pandemic. I'm currently working as a dishwasher at a grocery store to make ends meet. But not only this, as college degrees become more common, the pay and power those degrees once afforded will decline. Supply and demand and all that. Basically, yes, even though looking at certain aspects make it appear as though upward mobility has taken place, the reality is the level of power in the economy hasn't changed. Consumerism. Zweig explains that consumerism has come to dominate social life in the US. Keeping up with the Joneses, consumer identity, brands, fandoms, consumption has come to be the way we represent social standing, or class standing, in America. Did you buy organic kale, or Hungry Man, or Lunchables, or a Nutribar? Did you buy it at Walmart, or Safeway, or Trader Joe's, or the local farmer's market? What did you buy? What are the brands? What do they say to you? What do they say about you? Zweig argues that this focus on consumption rather than labor has been to our own demise. He states, consumption cannot change anything in the economic power working class people exert, of course. It can only mean the fake power of imitation and make-believe, which ultimately must be empty and unsatisfying, as so much consumption actually is. And Zweig argues that a consumer-minded public sees things like a workers' strike as a problem rather than a source of strength, as a class-conscious public would see it. Ideology and politics of the Cold War. Basically, this all played out in a lot of different ways. Celebration of the working class became kind of a commie thing, plus working class union activism was kind of tainted by a history of sexism and racist discrimination. Plus, movements for women's liberation and racial justice saw white men as the enemy, but didn't always responsibly distinguish between white men with power and poor working class people who happened to be white men. And this wasn't really helped by reactionary white male movements such as the hard hats during the Nixon administration and things like that. And lastly, media. Zweig argues that organized working people are ignored or hostilely vilified in mass media. Now, I don't see too much of the hostility towards organized labor outside of, say, Fox News or something like that.
Poor families in the United States are not what they used to be.
But there is a lot of omission taking place. I mean, the quality of life in Married with Children or Roseanne or Malcolm in the Middle are already a little above my pay grade. But look at Modern Family, Arrested Development, Fresh Off the Boat. What's with these upper middle class lifestyles that are so outside the working class majority experience? Where's the sleeping on your sister's couch because your parents lost their home in the housing crisis? Where's the story of workers banding together to try and start a union? Where's pulling 50+ hour weeks because your minimum wage job doesn't make ends meet? Chapter 3. Why class is important. Leading off of the last point of the previous chapter, Zweig argues that when society fails to acknowledge the existence and experience of working people, it robs them of an articulate sense of themselves and their place in society. Zweig explains, in the last half of the 19th century and the first half of the 20th, the United States had a vibrant working class culture. Theater, magazines, and a whole literary world dedicated to working class life. Working class newspapers with broad circulation addressed all questions of society. Working class social clubs and political parties brought working people together. All these helped define the lives and assert the interests of working people. It's hard to imagine it now, but look at films like Reds. There really was a vibrant, specifically working class media in the United States. And now with corporate media, this has basically been dead for the last few decades. But perhaps things are turning around. I mean, you're watching this, aren't you? Perhaps things like BreadTube, and with access to working class music like Ramshackle Glory or Low Key, or with news sources like It's Going Down or Genstrike, perhaps we are, at least in some part, turning things around. Zweig argues that without a working class culture enumerating and exposing the ills and enemies of the working class, the capitalist media has come to offer us a whole host of false targets. And this brings us to Chapter 4, looking at the underclass. Here Zweig looks at America's reactionary movement. And this didn't start with the alt-right in 2016, of course. No, we had the segregationists and the anti-civil rights folks, the anti-hippie hard hat folks, and the super patriot post-9/11 folks, and the reactionary movement of today. As Zweig states, the angry white guy is something of a cliche in American politics. As the conditions of working class life become harder, a crueler politics has come to prevail. And of course we see where this anger is channeled. Immigrants, folks on welfare, LGBT folks, women, minorities, and all that. And Zweig argues, our children do not have a brighter future because our anger has found these targets, provided to us by opinion makers and political leaders over the past 3 decades. The opposite is true. And unfortunately, yeah, I'm sure you know someone like this in your own life, but for me, it's my reactionary father. He literally spent the last few months of his life working 60 to 80 hours a week trying to provide for his family. A working class guy who struggled all his life and struggled with cancer and trying to financially prepare his family for his absence, and yet this reactionary angry white male, due to talk radio and Fox News and all that other BS, thought that trans people and Muslims and immigrants were the biggest threats in his life. And Zweig concludes, going after false targets misses the real target. Poor jobs, poor education, poor prospects, these things aren't caused by poor people. They are part and parcel of a social and economic system run for the benefit of the capitalist. Economic grievances belong at the boss's door. Chapter 5, looking at values, family and otherwise. Zweig explains what is the value system of America, namely, rugged individualism. And rugged individualism ignores our sense of social responsibility. He states, we cannot protect ourselves individually by referring only to our immediate self-interest. We have to be concerned with the relationships we have to the broader community as well. Their lives literally are our own.
Men, as soon as their interests do not absolutely clash, act in concert, harmoniously, and perform collective work of a very complex nature.
It is often argued that capitalists are so highly rewarded for their work because they take on the big risks. They make the initial investments, they make the big choices, and it's also argued that folks who ask for free education or universal health care or other government services are just being entitled and asking for handouts. But Zweig corrects these common misconceptions. It's the workers who take on the big risks, risking their health and safety on the job. Who really risks losing everything if the company goes out of business? It's their communities that are at risk when pollution makes water undrinkable. And it's actually the capitalists who have a sense of entitlement, asking for bailouts and tax loopholes and military interventions on their behalf, and lucrative government contracts and all that. And Zweig concludes, The capitalist sense of entitlement is out of touch with reality because it denies the social foundation of their wealth. Poor people's claims to society's help with the provision of basic needs or to common courtesy and respect are more in tune with the realities of our mutual responsibilities. Chapter 6, The Working Class and Power. Zweig argues that this framing of the working class as middle class, as explained in chapters 2 and 3, and this targeting and vilifying of the poor, as explained in chapters 4 and 5, has caused the working class to lose track of their real enemy, the capitalist class. Zweig starts by explaining what I'm sure you've heard before, that the decline in living standards in the US coincides with the decline in union membership, and that throughout the world, union membership is heavily correlated with living standards. Zweig explains, each business operates in the context of the entire market, so that the workforce is subject to the force of competitive pressures. As long as the workforce is tied to the fortunes of one company alone, and the company has to survive in the market, the power of workers in one company will be incomplete at best. This is why radical labor and one big union is so important, and why I'm skeptical of the ability of syndicalism or the promotion of co-ops to drastically change the economy. If syndicalism or co-ops are done on a shop-by-shop basis, it will fail in the long run because it will be reliant on the success of only one company, but still subject to the capitalist market pressures of the overall economy. Zweig argues that competition can sometimes be constructive, for example, improving productivity through technological innovation or improved methods of training. But competition is often destructive. Speed-ups, cutting corners on safety or quality, externalizing the costs through tax subsidies or pollution. And Zweig states, if a business can lower its costs by paying women less for the same work as men, or by paying substandard wages to blacks, Hispanics, or immigrants, management will take that easy but pernicious path rather than do the right thing by treating everyone equally and finding another way to compete. Zweig then looks at people of color and women who've ascended to positions of power in the US, and who often held right-wing or pro-capitalist positions. This all reminds me of the trickle-down racial justice section discussed in the New Jim Crow. And Zweig basically argues that working class and union political history is full of the mistreatment of women and minorities, and that the history of women and minorities in power is full of people who screwed over the working class and poor. And Zweig concludes, working class politics cannot be a substitute for identity politics based on race, gender, or sexual orientation. To be most effective, working class politics needs to complement and incorporate these other movements.
Intersectionality.
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 Chapter 7, Power and Globalization. The chapter starts by explaining that we may feel like the globalized economy has made worker organizing impossible. However, we often forget that capitalists have always moved shops from one town or city or state to another as a means of combating labor organizing. And Zweig argues, it makes no more sense to solve the problems created by international trade by stopping that trade than it does to save jobs by stopping all trade between Oregon and Nebraska. When there are problems caused by international trade, the focus needs to be on fixing the problems, not stopping the trade. Psst, Bernie, you might want to drop some of that old school protectionist stuff. It's a little outdated. Zweig explains that trade in capitalism incurs benefits, and that the problem with globalization is not the creation or loss of jobs, but that these benefits from trade have overwhelmingly gone to the capitalists. Zweig's solution is this. At the international level, solving these problems will involve three things: asserting the standards of the International Labor Organization, ILO, and the United Nations Declaration of Universal Human Rights, enforcing these standards through government action, and bringing to bear the power of a labor movement organized across international boundaries. Zweig argues that this is what is important for workers in a globalized economy, that when workers of one country are working for one employer that operates in many different countries, they need to have a globalized understanding of labor organization. Chapter 8: Power and the Government. Zweig gives a history of economic power being handed over from governments to capitalism, the history of neoliberalism, and the rise of Thatcherism and Reaganomics and all that. He then looks at governments as a service provider and explains what is called the social wage, which is government programs and services provided to people out of tax revenue. Things like public education, food stamps, public housing, healthcare, publicly funded higher education, and all that. And Zweig explains, when the government provides resources through the social wage, two important things happen. People have access to basic services independent of their income or even of having a job, and private employers don't need to pay their employees a wage big enough to buy those services in the market. Both are consequences of the social nature of our economy. Basically, Zweig explains that companies don't know who from the public will work for them, and so they have a vested interest, a social responsibility in the welfare of the general public. And he states, simply paying a private wage at the time of employment is not enough, because the productive capacity of working people is determined long before they are hired by any particular employer, in a process that society is responsible for collectively. But, to be honest, I don't think I follow. As my Radical Reviewer stickers explain, good for business equals bad for people. And why is that? Well, because employers benefit at the workers' expense. They benefit from workers' desperation. As Alexander Berkman explains in the ABC of Anarchism, it is clear that your interests as a worker are different from the interests of your capitalist masters. The better wages the boss pays you, the less profit he makes out of you. If your employer wants to cut your sick pay, wants to cut your insurance, wants to cut corners on safety standards, and in this day and age with the pandemic wants to force you to work despite clear and present danger, I don't see what makes Zweig think that capitalists will recognize their social responsibility to the public. No, what's good for business is bad for people. Zweig then looks at public versus private services, how public schools and social security and public prisons and the like tend to provide better services or cheaper costs than their private market competitors. It's almost like focusing on providing goods and services rather than focusing on maximizing profits is better. It's almost like capitalism is bad. Chapter 9: Into the New Millennium. That title sounds a bit dated. Interestingly, Zweig asks us to look back to 1995, and to 1960, and to 1925, and 1890, and 1855, and reflect on how different all these worlds were. Reflect on what big changes led to total paradigm shifts. The world before the Cold War, before Africa's independence movements, before the Chinese Revolution, before Hitler, before the Great Depression, before the US Civil War. And Zweig concludes, 35 years is not much time, less than a person's working lifetime, but it is more than enough time for profound change in social organization, politics, technology, culture, economic life. So how does the future change? Zweig argues that the future isn't arbitrary. Its seeds are in the present, in the tensions that exist within society. The power to make these decisions, the power to make history, is closely tied to the power of class. Interestingly enough, if you backed Bernie Sanders in 2016 or in 2020, you might feel similar to how Zweig felt when he wrote this book. Zweig saw the new leadership of the AFL-CIO and the creation of the Labour Party in 1986 as key focal points for where great change was going to emerge. And I know I've had feelings like this. 10 years ago, when I was a young college pup, first being radicalized, listening to punk music, and looking out the bus window on the way to college and seeing the Occupy encampment of my city, and knowing that there was Occupy encampments all over the country, all over the world, and feeling like I was witnessing the focal point of where great change was going to emerge. I thought that America was finally waking up from the blind super patriotism that was the post 9/11 era. The economy had collapsed and radical protests were taking place all over the world. A great moment of change was upon us. But it wasn't to be so, and perhaps you're reflecting on that as well, reflecting on a fascist presidency and the rise of the alt-right and fascism around the world. And you're thinking about the rising popularity of Bernie Sanders and the Justice Democrats or whoever, and the popularity of left-leaning platforms among the people. Perhaps you're seeing the focal point of a brand new radical change. Or maybe not. Maybe it's just small sparks, just like the WTO protests and the Occupy movement all those years ago. But they're not going to stay just sparks. These sparks are going to grow into embers, the embers that will grow into a great fire of change that will come. Big changes some point in the future. Zweig concludes the text with the following story. When the auto workers at Henry Ford's Rogue plant organized a union there in 1940, as many as 1 out of every 3 workers among the 78,000 people in the factory was an anti-union spy who reported union activity to the management. Ford had goon squads who regularly beat up union organizers and broke up union meetings. But the union prevailed, and the working class won some power. American labor history is full of traumatic stories like this. We know that we will be surprised by how the future works out. What seems impossible or silly or too strange for words today will not necessarily seem that way in 30 years' time. Conclusion. Well, if you're watching this around the months in which it came out, we are in the middle of a global coronavirus pandemic. Massive store closures, quarantine, a lot of talk of essential workers. Many people have been thrust into class consciousness, made aware of their power as a working class majority during this pandemic. Many folks who were already aware are using the power and support garnered from what's being called essential workers to make demands. Rent strikes, labor strikes, call-outs, demands for protective gear, health insurance, and more and larger stimulus packages, hazard pay, and unionization? Perhaps during this pandemic we are seeing Zweig's ideas in action. Awareness of our power as workers. The pandemic is causing us to think of solutions on a global scale. Perhaps the focal point of change is upon us. I certainly hear a lot more talk of end capitalism and capitalism is the crisis being thrown around these days. Yeah, although this quarantine has many of us stuck inside, this pandemic has brought the failures of capitalism out into the harsh light of day. And now it's up to us, a working class majority, to demand change. And as always, I'd like to thank my wonderful patrons. Your tremendous support has allowed me to get dog insurance and allowed me to support other creators who I couldn't otherwise support, and you've provided me with extra funds for books and dog toys and things like that, which is really awesome. I appreciate you folks a lot. And if you like what I do here and you want to support the show, you can go to patreon.com/radicalreviewer. And if you're interested in radical theory, looking for a book recommendation or whatever, you can get your radical reviews here with the Radical Reviewer. Thanks for watching.
I've been working all my life, but ain't got nothing to show. I ain't telling you nothing you don't already know. I've been working all my life, but ain't got nothing to show. Wanna run up
You pick up a job to buy a house or raise kids or to impress your dad. You work away your life, and what does it get you?
Smiles and faces?
No. You get cash. Cash that can't buy back what the job takes. Not if you rode every seahorse in the world.